Endgames are hard. If for some reason you can't imagine how difficult and how tricky to learn endgames are, picture this. Try to learn every single opening there is in chess to a competent level. We could all probably agree that that would be impossibly difficult. Endgames are exactly the same. There is this endgame, and this one, and this one, this one, this one, this one, this, you get the idea. So if there is almost an infinite amount of endgames, how could you possibly learn all of them? The answer is you don't. If that were the case, this video would be several hours long. Instead of trying to memorize 100 answers on the test, you create an unstoppable winning formula. In today's video, we're going to be looking at every single endgame principle you need to know to crush your next opponent and create that winning formula. We're going to be splitting them up into 6 different sections, one for every piece on the chessboard. For complete transparency, there will be a couple of very basic endgame principles in this video. However, I've mixed in various advanced ones because I want this video to be useful for everyone. If you have any questions about any of the topics in this video, feel free to leave a comment. I try to reply to all of my comments on my long form videos. So without further ado, let's get into the endgame masterclass. The first piece that we will look at is the king. Fortresses. It's very difficult to explain exactly how to create a fortress in an endgame, because not only are they very rare, but they can occur in a multitude of ways. A fortress is when, despite being down an incredible amount of material, you can hold off for a draw in certain positions because your king's defenses are impenetrable. If the opponent has no more progress to be made, you can rescue draws from the deepest depths of defeat. King activity and centralization. You should constantly be looking to activate your king in the endgame. It quickly becomes the primary piece in a lot of situations, and oftentimes games will be won simply due to advantageous king activity. When transitioning into the endgame, begin to bring your king into the center of the board to make sure you don't fall behind on king activity. Think of it as opening development, but in the endgame. During the endgame, your opponent will attempt to inactivate your king, whether that's by cutting it off with a rook, pushing it back with checks, or anything under the same umbrella. Do not allow this to happen. It's never too late to checkmate. This one might seem very obvious, but not enough people talk about it in my opinion. For whatever reason, people think that checkmates cannot occur during an endgame because the main goal is to promote pawns and make queens. That is not the case at all. In many cases, you can actually threaten checkmates to gain a tempo on your opponent. Sometimes that threat can even be unstoppable. Always be aware of potential checkmating ideas. You might not even need to convert a long drawn out endgame when there's a stronger move on the board. Opposition and distant opposition. Opposition is very important to learn, and you should also learn how to do it in a time scramble as it directly leads to queen and king versus king checkmates. I recommend doing this through chess.com's endgame trainer. Very quickly, we'll jump over to a different scene to quickly explain how opposition works. The main concept you need to understand when looking at opposition is simply to not step in front of your own pawn before your opponent does. For example, if we do that and play king f5, this is a draw. We blundered a draw, you can see on the eval bar, because after king f7, we can't make progress because the black king will mirror our king no matter what we do. We push our pawn, they play king e8 in this position, and after f7, king f8, king f6 is a draw by stalemate. So instead we'll play a move like king g6, and if black goes onto the same file as the pawn, now we can as well because we didn't do it first. It's black's turn to move. They have to step off the file and we can play king g7 and allow our pawn to come all the way up the board whilst defending the promotion square. If you're playing with black in this position and your opponent does blunder the opposition, you need to copy their king every time it moves. For example, you need to play king f7 here. If they play king e5, you need to play king e7. If they don't move their king, you need to go back to the file that the pawn is on without allowing their king any space to come onto the same file. So in this case, white didn't move their king, so we go back onto the same file as the pawn. Importantly, if they move their pawn again, we do not mirror the king because it didn't move. We go back onto f8. If their king moves, now we mirror the king. And if they check, we go to f8 and they'll stalemate us on the next move. Shouldering. Shouldering is very important to understand when you're trying to draw a game and when you're trying to win a game. When a position is locked, the kings will commonly contest each other for space, with one king trying to get into enemy territory. This can usually be avoided by the defending king though, through shouldering. The idea is to exactly mirror the opposing king's movement as it tries to outflank. This makes it impossible for progress to be made. It's a little bit like trying to sneak up and jump scare your own reflection in the mirror. If the enemy king is simply a reflection of your own king, there is simply no way to progress. The rule of the square. A very well-known rule, but we'll quickly touch on it anyway. The rule of the square is a way of quickly calculating whether your king will be able to catch a distant passed pawn before it promotes by drawing a square with the king as one point and the pawn as another. My advice for this is to actually never use the rule of the square. In my opinion, it's much easier and much more reliable to just count out the moves in your head or by drawing arrows on the board. You need to be capable in the calculation department when it comes to playing chess, so why take a shortcut here? Stalemate. Speaking of stalemate, it's a very important thing to consider in the endgame. There really is no principle here I can teach you other than to be very mindful of stalemates in the endgame. Whether a stalemate benefits you or will blunder a draw for you, it's never too late to stalemate. Triangulation. Triangulation is another very important chess principle to understand. The general idea of triangulation is to waste moves with your king so you achieve a recurring position with the only difference of whose move it is. For example, in this position, white would like to break through with its king, but cannot because of the black king's presence. But using triangulation, the white king can use its available squares to get an identical position, this time forcing black to move and concede positionally. Zugzwang. Zugzwang is infamously famous for being annoying to say, but I do appreciate the Germans putting two Z's in the word because that's kind of cool. Zugzwang is when you force your opponent to make a bad move because they don't have any good ones. A common Zugzwang theme in Endgames is trapping a king and giving it no moves. From there, it will be forced to make the remaining pawn moves it has, allowing you to queen whilst never blundering a stalemate. Now let's look at the queen. Learn king-queen versus king checkmates in a time scramble. This is a very simple thing to do, and again, I recommend Chess.com's Endgame Trainer to do this. You'd be very surprised how often simply checkmating your opponent with a king and queen will be impossible due to time trouble, but the mate is quite literally pre-movable. Very quickly, I'll show you exactly how to pre-move this mate. This mate is extremely simple, and you don't even want to move your king until every single move can be pre-moved. The idea is you want to cut the enemy king off onto one single file or rank. From there, the mate can be entirely pre-moved. Every time you make a move, the black king will actually be in Zugzwang, being forced to give up one single file or rank. For example, let's play queen g4 and cut off all of this rank. Now the black king had to move, so we'll cut it off again from the file it just came to, until eventually it is cut off onto one single file. From here, we can pre-move the mate entirely because we know exactly where the black king will go. If we play king g2, the only move is king a5. Queen b3, king a6. Queen b4, king a7, queen b5, it only has king a8, and now no matter what we do, it only has these two squares to go to, so we can bring our king all the way over and checkmate the king by pre-moving. The engine will move quite fast, so these might not all be pre-moves, but you get the idea. King g2, and checkmate. That was all pre-moves, we didn't need to think at all there, and we got a checkmate in under 2 seconds. You should learn how to do this mate in a very short amount of time. I guarantee you it will win you some elo at some point. Stopping the last passer. In many cases, it looks like you'll have to settle for a draw and sacrifice your queen for the opponent's advanced passed pawn. This is not always the case. Very quickly, we'll cut over to a different scene and I'll show you how to convert these endgames and the times in which it'll be a draw. If the remaining pawn is on any of the files highlighted here, it will be a win for whoever has the queen. I'll show you exactly how. After queen c4 check, if black tries to play king b1, you're going to check, threatening to fork the king and the pawn. After they come back, queen c3 check. If they leave their pawn, you will take it and easily win the game, but if they hide under their pawn, now because the pawn cannot promote because it's blockaded, you bring your king. If they try to unblockade their pawn with a move like king e2, then you keep checking until they are blockading their pawn again. If they come down to e1, you check. If they go over to f1, check. Forking this and this, they have to come back. Queen e3 check, king d1, and king d4. From here, it's a lot easier. If king c2, we check with the queen, and when they go back under, they have to go back under, otherwise they'll lose their pawn, they'll blockade their pawn. We bring the king, their only move is king e1, we check, and now this is a simple queen and king checkmating pattern. But it doesn't work if the pawn is on the c file or the f file, and I'll show you exactly how. When black plays king b1, white will try this method to get the king underneath its own pawn, but the issue is the black king doesn't have to. If king a1 and you check, I'll come back. Queen b3 check, usually we would go under our pawn, but this time we can play king a1, and if you take the pawn, this is stalemate, so it's impossible for white to win. Similarly, if the pawns are on the a file or the h file, it will also be a draw. This one is a lot easier to understand, and the reason that it's a draw is because there is simply no way for white to force me to go underneath my own pawn. For example, queen d1, king b2, and there is literally no variation of moves that white can come up with to force me to go to a1. Because of this, I will constantly threaten to promote my pawn, and if you bring your king, I'll make a queen, and this is simply a draw. Perpetual check. In many cases, even if you're up significant amounts of material, if queens are still on the board, you always run the risk of perpetual check. No matter how many pawns you're up, if you trade your other pieces and not your queen, you always run that risk. There is no easy way to teach you to convert endgames where you possess a single pawn's advantage with both queens remaining. It's something you learn with time and practice. My number one piece of advice would be to trade your queens before you trade your other pieces if you do possess that single pawn advantage, and the opposite if you don't possess the single pawn advantage. Perpetual check is much easier to defend when you have other pieces helping to block those checks. Now we'll look at the rooks. Cut off your opponent's king. A primary job for rooks in the endgame is to control files, and a big part of this is cutting off your opponent's pieces, especially the king. Other pieces can also be cut off, namely the knight can be trapped on one side of the board due to its unique movement style, but usually cutting off the king is most effective. The king is such an important piece in the endgame, and if your rook cuts the king off to one of the sides of the board, it's completely out of the game. You're essentially playing up an entire piece, and most of the time, allowing your king to be cut off from the action will always result in a loss. Sometimes file control is more valuable than a free pawn. Have you ever seen a free pawn for the taking in an endgame? It's not always going to be the best move. Usually, we associate poisonous pawns with pawns which if you take them, you'll be skewered and lose the pawn back anyway. However, in this case, if you grab the pawn and surrender control of the open file, it's even worse. After you greedily grab the pawn, your opponent can take your file, enter your position, win back the pawn, and sometimes more pawns in the process, and still seize control of the important file you abandoned. Controlling files is so unbelievably important in endgames. It should not be underestimated. Learn king rook versus king checkmates in a time scramble. The endgame is always going to be the game phase where you have the least amount of time. Sometimes, even in positions you would consider easy, it's simply impossible to convert them with the amount of time you have left unless you practice specifically for this situation. You need to be practicing your simple rook checkmates in time trouble. You never know when it'll come in handy. Rooks like to be behind passed pawns. This is a very standard principle, but should usually be followed. Rooks should be behind passed pawns. This allows the passed pawn to be pushed up the board whilst the rook defends it. You might be wondering why waste the move putting the rook behind the pawn when I can just push the pawn first. Well, in this case, the enemy rook would jump behind the pawn, threatening to capture it and stopping it from pushing. The reason we want to support our pawn like this is to either force a king or a rook behind the other side of the pawn. This completely inactivates whichever piece sits on the other side, as the further you push your pawn, the less squares it will be able to dictate. Rooks like open files. This is a very straightforward principle. In endgames containing rooks, they should be able to use the files that they can dominate. Rooks become increasingly more powerful with the more pieces that are traded off the board, which makes them especially strong in the endgame. Don't keep your rooks passive by defending single pawns or locking them out of the game. Put them on open files so they can dictate the game. For any American viewers, think of the rook in an endgame like the quarterback. Same side pawns is a draw if the pawn discrepancy is 0 or 1. If there are only pawns on the same side of the board and the only pieces left on the board are rooks, usually it will be a draw. There is simply no way to make progress in these endgames. However, you should definitely try to press for a win if you are up the pawn. The main piece of advice here is don't allow this situation to occur in the first place if you are up a pawn. Try to keep pawn dynamics on the board so you don't blunder this basic drawn concept. The bridge. The bridge is a common endgame tactic used to stop your opponent from holding the promotion square or from sacrificing a rook for the last pawn to secure a draw. For this, you need your king to be very close to your pawn with either a rook, bishop, or knight able to swing underneath the pawn. Then, when your king is inevitably checked, instead of hiding behind your pawn, you hide in front of it. When your king is checked again, you bring the minor piece in front of your king to block the check. This usually allows your pawn to be promoted as the promotion square becomes indefensible. Now let's move on to the bishop. Bishops will sneak around the back. In any kind of endgame involving bishops, they need to attack the base of any pawn chain to actually start capturing pawns. To do this, bishops will attempt to sneak around the back of the board to eat pawns from the bottom. Usually, if there is no defender of this pawn, the game will be over. Once a bishop gets to this position, the likelihood is it's already too late and you need to start damage control so the bishop doesn't take the entire pawn chain. One slip like this can turn a completely drawn endgame into a decisive one, sacrificing for draws. This may be very obvious, but if your opponent is threatening to promote a pawn into a queen, you need to make sure you're able to sacrifice your last remaining piece for that pawn. On many occasions, the attacking side will attempt to make this impossible for you, whether by building a bridge beneath their pawn for rooks, holding off squares from the knight, or blocking a bishop's diagonal. It's imperative that you make these kind of sacrifices sooner rather than later to make sure you don't let your opponent out and get a win. Don't bother learning king, bishop, and knight versus king checkmates. It never happens. I will never understand people telling anyone that this mate is important to know. I've played 24,000 games online and several over the board games and have only ever needed to know it once. The funny thing is, it was in a blitz game with 20 seconds on my clock, so even if I did know how to execute the mate, it wouldn't have mattered. It's a checkmating pattern even grandmasters struggle with. Don't bother learning it. Don't bother learning the king, bishop, and bishop versus king checkmate. It never happens. The same thing applies for this checkmating pattern. I won't elaborate on it too much, but it simply never happens in real games. Only players who intend on playing over the board and maybe going for titles should consider learning this checkmate. Opposite colored bishop endgames. Opposite colored bishop endgames can be very tricky because leading up to those positions, it can be very difficult to see if it'll be a draw or a win. However, when you are in the position, it'll be very apparent whether there is progress to be made or not. Because bishops can lose tempo, which we'll touch on later, a bishop can sit blockading multiple pawns whilst the king is not forced to move whatsoever. This leads to positions where the attacking side cannot make progress despite being up several pawns, because their bishop cannot contribute in any meaningful way, because it only dominates one single complexion. The only advice that I can give you for this is to not trade into opposite colored bishop endgames if you're up a pawn, and vice versa, if you're down a pawn, you should trade into these endgames. Losing tempo. A very strong characteristic of a bishop is that it can lose tempo and evade any kind of triangulation, opposition, or shouldering tactics. For example, in this position, white wants to stay blockading these passed pawns. It doesn't matter where black's king moves, because if it does move, it gives the white king another square to blockade on. However, if black had a bishop, it could lose a tempo with it, forcing white's king to move to an undesirable square, whilst also allowing the black king to maintain its position. In some positions, knights can also do this, but not all positions. Wrong colored bishop endgames. A typical endgame draw is a wrong colored bishop endgame. This occurs when the attacking side is not only up a pawn, but also a bishop. The key characteristic of this endgame is that the promotion square the pawn is attempting to promote on is a different color than the complexion of the bishop. For example, a dark squared bishop and a black pawn on the H-file would be a draw. This is because the bishop cannot intervene in this classic drawn position, as it cannot check on the square the defending king will want to sit on. For example, if we take away the bishop from the equation, this is a common flank pawn draw, because there is only one file adjacent to the pawn, meaning usual opposition does not take place. Now let's move on to knights. In knight versus knight endgames, think of your knight as a big flexible pawn. Knight versus knight endgames are very reliant on your king being active and harmoniously working together with your knight to attack indefensible pawns and eventually pushing what remains. Think of your knight as a big pawn. It acts very similarly, as it can only attack diagonal squares in front of it, whilst the squares horizontal and behind the knight are most commonly used for rerouting. The point of using your knight as a big pawn is to stop the enemy king and knight working harmoniously together, not allowing the king to gain space in the position. If this can be achieved, usually beneficial reroutes will be possible due to the inactive enemy king, or progression can be made with your own king, further activating it. Knights can't lose tempo like bishops can. Knights can lose tempo in a few situations, but in any situation where the knight also has a job and needs to lose tempo at the same time, it cannot. For example, in the previous position we looked at, the knight cannot lose a tempo because it would undefend its own pawn. Similarly, in this position, the white king is being boxed in by the black knight. Losing a tempo would be great here for white to help it escape. However, losing a tempo with the knight would unguard another square for the black king to do the same job on. Because of this characteristic, this is a draw. Knights trip over their own feet. Just because a knight is close to a pawn that is going to promote doesn't mean the knight can stop that promotion. People love to assume this for whatever reason, but knights can often trip over their own feet and have no useful reroute back to the important promotion square, allowing the opponent to freely make a queen. Be very careful when a knight is the only thing defending a promotion square. Knights are worse in endgames with multiple pawn islands. Because the knight cannot travel from one side of the board to the other, it is going to be dominated by bishops in these scenarios. Even if a knight manages to defend one side of the board, allowing the king to take care of the other side, not only can the knight not waste moves without undefending the pawns, but it also can't be mutually guarded by the pawn it's defending like a bishop can. In some cases, it can work, and the knight will do just enough to draw the game. But in most cases, the bishop will dominate. The advice again is to not trade into these endgames if you have the knight, and to trade into them if you have the bishop. Knights can fork promotion squares. In many occasions, it will be temporarily completely fine for your opponent to make a queen as long as there's a knight on the board. Moving a knight to a square that threatens to fork the king and the promotion square means that the enemy cannot promote unless they want their queen to be forked on the next move. This can allow just enough time for other pieces to help defend the promotion and swing the game into your favor. Now let's move on to the final piece, the pawn. Further advanced pawns are more valuable. If there are two sets of pawns staring at each other, but one set of pawns lies deeper in enemy territory than the other, the pawns are more valuable to whoever is closest to promotion. This should be rather obvious, but a lot of people don't recognize this as a beneficial asset in games. If chess is being played on the opposite side of the board, and for example everything is traded off, those pawns can win the game for one player and lose the game for the other. Why? Because sometimes it doesn't matter who gets there first, but who doesn't get there last. A pawn sacrifice could occur, only requiring the king to be there to support its pawn to promotion, and just like that, the advanced pawns have shown much more value. Doubled or isolated pawns are 10 times worse in endgames. As more pieces drop off the board, doubled and isolated pawns become a much bigger target. There is no one way to exploit or defend these kind of situations. It all depends on the position. But the advice here is to not allow these weaknesses to exist when transposing into an endgame. People think that these structures are admittedly undesirable, but holdable. In a lot of circumstances, it will be completely losing because of a simple imperfection in your pawn structure. Flank pawns are much more desirable in endgames than central pawns. This one is quite obvious. Flank pawns are better than central pawns because it counteracts the principle of centralizing your king. If both kings aim to be central to the board, the most valuable pawns are the flank pawns because they're the furthest away from the king. If the king cannot easily catch a pawn on the other side of the board, it's a massive weakness in the position and can be often used as a weapon to win games. Passed pawns. First and foremost, passed pawns should be pushed. They become increasingly more dangerous as they progress up the board, because the blockading piece will have less and less control over the game and less squares to retreat back to should another piece kick it from its defensive position. It should be noted that passed pawns shouldn't be pushed if you can't adequately defend it. If you push your pawn and that allows your opponent to attempt to capture it, don't push it. If, however, two advanced passed pawns are connected, the defending side should find a god and pray to it, because there is no stopping two advanced passed pawns. You either let them promote or be bulldozed positionally. Pawn activity. Pawn activity is extremely important in close quarters endgames. In the absence of pieces, pawns need to take on the role of pieces in dictating where the enemy king can and can't go. If a pawn structure lets the enemy king waltz into the position, the pawn chain will fall from the bottom and the game will be lost. Pawns should aim to deflect the king away whilst progress is made with your own king, allowing more progress for yourself and less for your opponent. Pawn sacrifices. Pawn sacrifices are immensely important to understand, especially in endgames where a lot of the pawns are still on the board. A pawn sacrifice is the act of allowing a pawn to be captured to allow a pawn adjacent to it to push forwards and promote to a queen. Sometimes these are not obvious, and a pawn sacrifice to allow a breakthrough can be hidden behind multiple sacrifices. Likewise, in a lot of scenarios, pieces can be sacrificed to allow a breakthrough. Right-colored pawns. In any endgame, you should purposely try to put your pawn structure on the opposite complexion of your opponent's bishop. This can completely take your opponent's piece out of the game, as there's no pawns for the enemy bishop to target and can be as dominating as being up an entire piece. There are very few exceptions to this rule. It is almost always a good idea to try and achieve this. And that concludes this video on endgames. Of course, there are multiple classic endgame studies that didn't quite make it into this video. However, those positions would be far too complicated to explain in one video, so I would have to make a completely separate one. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that. Whilst you should go and learn them, they can also be solved using the principles that we explained in this video. I've also recently launched a Patreon page for anyone that wants to see additional content or have early access to the content you see here. Of course, you don't have to be a paying member. There will still be a few free things that you can find over there, like the transcripts for these videos. But for anyone that does want to support these videos, it would be greatly appreciated. Regardless, I hope you all enjoyed this video and learned something new from it. Hopefully we'll have the second episode of the speedrun series up this week. And of course, if you do want me to make any videos on any kind of topic in the future, please do let me know in the comments.